and I am a second-year PhD student in the Urban Education Department. I wanted to offer just a few housekeeping words first. Dr. Vaught will be jumping off the call at 12:55 because she has another meeting to attend. And I also wanted to encourage everyone within the audience to please send in questions as the talk goes on relating to the conversation, or if you had any other questions about Dr. Miner's work in general, please feel free to send those in, because at the end of the conversation, I will be facilitating a question and answer series with the questions that you all send in. And so I wanted to first introduce Dr. Erica Miners. Writer, educator, and organizer, Dr. Erica Miners has published in a range of periodicals, including Meridians, Women's Studies Quarterly, Harvard Educational Review, Radical Teacher, American Quarterly, Captive Genders, and In These Times. Her current work includes For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, a co-edited anthology, The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom, and the co-authored The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, and the forthcoming co-authored Abolition and Feminism Now. So thank you, Dr. Miners, for joining us here at the University of Pittsburgh and in the Center for Urban Education. I will introduce Dr. Sabina Vaught now. So Dr. Sabina Vaught is a professor and the inaugural chair of the new Department of Teaching, Learning, and Leading. Yes, so there is Dr. Vaught. I wanted to make sure that I kept her introduction short per her request. And so as we move forward, we will first start with some words from Dr. Erica Miners to give us a little bit of context about herself and her work. And then Dr. Vaught will enter the conversation to facilitate a question and answer between the two of them. Thank you everyone for coming. And Dr. Miners, the table is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. I want to say that it's been really filling and energizing 2 days with the community here at Pitt. So I want to thank you for that deeply. The Equity and Justice Scholars with Chris and Jazkia, the White Co-Conspirators Group, thank you so much, Christy McGuire, the Heinz Fellows this morning, just brilliant folks. I also just want to acknowledge and appreciate Dean Valerie Kinlock here at Pitt. And I also want to just deeply appreciate the labor and the patience and the invitation from Dr. Elon Dancy at the Center for Urban Education, and all the thoughtful planning that made this visit possible from the staff at the center. So the amazing technological skills of Cassia Krogan, Sueno Viveros, just deep appreciation. I also just want to acknowledge that there's some powerful of my sheroes here at Pitt, Dr. Sabina Vaught, who is going to be joining me in a dialogue, not just a Q&A, a dialogue in a minute, and Dr. Lee Patel, and I'm just honored to be in some long-term community with both of those amazing women. And other thinkers, abolitionist thinkers in particular at Pitt, include Peter Campbell, Corey Holding, and Jules Gill Peterson, so I really appreciate and I grow from your work as well. And also the wider Pittsburgh community, Decarcerate PA, the Abolitionist Law Center there, and the newish coalition that's just been formed in Pittsburgh, the Educational Rights Network, I think it's called, teachers, parents, and young folks that are working to remove police from Pittsburgh schools. So wonderful, wonderful work that's happening in Pittsburgh that is shaping my context and the national movement. So of course I'm coming to you here from Chicago this morning, the land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Dawa, the Potawatomi nations. And before I jump in with just some brief remarks before our dialogue with Sabina and the Q&A together, I also just want to recognize the moment that we're in and just slow down. I'm a fast talker, take a breath, and just acknowledge the political moment, the health moment that we're in. I know many of us on the call are struggling with care for loved ones, the new wide world of Zoom, health challenges and losses in our networks, the heightened visibility of the always present white supremacy. I feel like this is sort of the political moment where our active reality is again being denied. So I want to just pause for a second here and just acknowledge that the sort of deep reality of this moment. I also want to just keep my comments short so that we can have a conversation. So I titled this building Abolition in Our Communities Now, and I want to do two things in maybe the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So I want to read a little bit from an emerging project about critical genealogies. And then I want to make a couple of just quick comments about abolition in this moment. And I'm reading from a piece about critical genealogies, a snippet of a project, because I feel that critical genealogies are so important in this moment as facets of abolition move from the margins towards the center. So surfacing these genealogies is not only going to help us understand sort of roots and rigor and analysis, but also where and how we might grow. So I'm here doing a talk about abolition because of collective movements, right? Because of largely young folks of color mobilizing. Their demands to defund police and schools and communities is because of organizing. Their reimagination of cash money bond is because of this organizing, because of decades of abolitionist feminist organizing in particular that produced new tools and analytics, languages, and more. So I want to just offer one snippet of sort of a deep genealogy to get us a sense of some of those trajectories, right? So just starting with also with a quote from Gloria Anzaldúa: "Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our head," right? So this political moment of demands to divest, shrink, or abolish, not fix policing emerged from decades of action and learning. So 20 years ago, to somewhat arbitrarily kind of offer a critical genealogy starting somewhere, 20 years ago, communities across Chicago were organizing by necessity to build and define safety outside of policing and imprisonment. While there are many examples, I draw attention to a cluster of feminist anti-violence groups that coalesced in response to the everyday forms of gender and sexual violence experienced by young women of color: street harassment, sexual assault, racism, transphobia, homophobia. So groups like A Long Walk Home, Mango Tribe, Aqua Moon, Females United for Action, FUFA, these groups recognize that protection would not come from their families, schools, or communities, and especially not police, but also that the harm that they experienced wasn't individual or just individual or private, but was endemic and ideologically sustained. These groups demanded not simply services or recognition, but structural and systems change. This local organizing and direct action tied racism, ableism, and capitalism to gender and sexual violence, and moved beyond indicting individual perpetrators to offering pathways for communities and neighborhoods to develop collective responses to gender and sexual violence. Their zines, spoken word events, street actions, and popular education workshops spotlighted the state's inability to often even recognize sexual and gender violence as harm, particularly when experienced by young women of color, including and especially those who are queer. And they also rejected the criminal legal system's ineffective and paltry responses. So by the start of the second decade in the 2000s, as a direct result of the national and increasingly local work of organizations like Insight and Critical Resistance, convenings, chapters, public statements, campaigns, and toolkits were developed. Chicago cultivated a small and thriving grassroots landscape of organizations explicitly identified as abolitionist, including the Chicago Legal Advocacy for Incarcerated Mothers, that centered the leadership and analysis of women impacted by incarceration, the creative anti-police direct action of the ad hoc group Queer to the Left and Gender Just, prolific anti-prison industrial complex educational materials and workshops and ad hoc groups curated by Project NIA, and so much more. Militant and direct self-defense campaigns for those targeted for deportation by the Organized Communities Against Deportation group. So I think it's really important to name these organizations. So I've just offered a few of them. These are largely initiated by women and queer people of color. These organizations constitute just a tiny slice of the long history of collaborative feminist abolition projects in Chicago and of course beyond, which have to a great extent operated outside the realm of funding from government and philanthropic foundations. These groups created tools and openings, workshops, curriculums, public statements, and open letters for a wide array of audiences to unlearn routine reliance on the police and to learn how to imagine and practice safety outside of the usual frameworks of policing and imprisonment. Tackling the intimate and everyday violence experienced by those marked as disposable by the state. These small everyday organizations built essential tools, practices, and mutual aid networks out of anger, love, and necessity. The accessible, free, horizontal political education undertaken by these organizations, often with no money, is breathtaking. Public convenings where people directly impacted share analysis about how to intervene and to interrupt the violence inflicted by the state. The many toolkits, safety labs, workshops, focused on addressing interpersonal harm without policing, the essays, books, articles, and blog posts that fleshed out how people are trying to grow accountability, healing, and transformation outside of a carceral frame. With scant resources, these groups created the necessary conditions to imagine, practice, and strengthen abolition. At times, this slow work of building up our collective capacity to imagine and act in ways that don't expand the prison industrial complex felt and continues to feel interminable. Yet another icebreaker in a workshop, right? A 2-hour meeting that maybe stretches into hour 3, a circle discussion where the introductions take the entire meeting, another spoken word performance, a version of the same crucial question from a participant: what about the bad people? For the first 2 decades of the new millennium, Chicago hosted it all, rehearsing and strengthening muscles and tools for a time to come. Transformative justice skill shares, Abolition 101 workshops, a summer community on the prison industrial complex, study groups, film screenings of the documentaries Vision of Abolition or Out in the Night, dreamed up and carried out by women, non-binary, and other queer folks. This is the always urgent, slow time of abolition. To some, when viewed outside of this genealogy, these scattered small grassroots campaigns and organizations are seen as disconnected, potentially failures. A laundry list of small organizations that fizzled without passing legislation or achieving anything. And many of these groups have shuttered, are no longer in operation. The list of our failures through one metric is long. An event had small turnout, a project ran out of money, a group disappeared. Even though in the context of the uprising of 2020, this landscape and most of these small groups have been forgotten or invisible. But not only do they deserve to be recognized as harbingers of a radical shift, their erasure weakens our collective ability to struggle for the long haul. And these forms of structural erasure, wow, that's a hard one to say together. A learned and organized epistemology of ignorance, to use Charles Mill's framing, is far from arbitrary. Our feminist, queer, women of color, queer folks of color, histories of resistances and organizing is impoverished by intention, often lethally, and often few traces remain of powerful and highly local campaigns that built state violence and shifted language and culture growing abolition. Legislation, law, and policies are too often framed as the only wins worth remembering. Yet the metrics for success and failure are created by the very systems and institutions that reproduce and naturalize racist and heteropatriarchal violence. Legislation, laws, and policy might be necessary, but they're never sufficient. This is the ecology of abolition feminism, the slow and urgent time of movements where some of the most critical relationships and shifts are often unrecognizable as wins. Yet the current move to fund Black futures would not have been possible without organizations like Insight. Yet our understanding of history, the ecology of social and political change, is intentionally narrowed, often whitewashed and straightened, too linear, and always in search of individuals and not collectives, legal and legislative wins, not processes, actions, and certainly not political education events. So yet organized forgetting isn't the only challenge. Many of these small networks fracture from pressures from funders to expand, to scale up, to streamline, to brand, right? To elevate a single charismatic leader, not a collective, to network with legislators, not ordinary people. Successful organizing that mobilizes people and makes effective demands on the state is often co-opted and absorbed. Feminist anti-violence scholar Mimi Kim describes the carceral state's ability to, quote, beckon accommodation or conjure disappearance out of every progressive impulse, end quote. So, yet far from a failure, this abolition feminist ecosystem of toolkits lost on the internet, study into action groups that leaned into the first and maybe forgot the second, sparsely attended indie documentary screenings, small clusters of militant picketers, campus groups that flare and dissipate, grew the demand and the dialogue to defund police, that prosecuting any one police officer could not be our solution. And this ecology term aims to mark that the logic of racial capitalism to scale up, for example, is not necessarily always compatible with our goals. Predicated on sameness, eradicating difference, scaling up sometimes eschews transformation. So I wanted just to offer that tiny, as my part one, critical genealogy, just to remind us that we're at this political moment of where demands for defunding the police, removing police from our communities and schools, really rethinking the logic of targeted criminalization is moving, slightly from the margin towards the center. And I just want to make sure that we are centering the decades of collective organizing, largely led, by folks of color, queer folks, feminists who've been doing this work in small organizations. I think it's crucial to sort of remember that genealogy in this moment. So I wanted to read that little snapshot, even though it's from Chicago. But I think that tiny richness of the snapshot, those tiny organizations, their workshops, their networks are kind of examples of what has happening in Pittsburgh, in New York, in Houston, in New Orleans, and also in Brisbane and London. So just to sort of center the discussion on sort of acknowledging that genealogy, because I think critical genealogies really do matter, not just to have us understand histories of left social movements, but also they inform our understanding of the present. And then briefly, before we move into a conversation with Sabina, I wanted to just make a couple of just quick comments about what I've been thinking about in relation to this moment about abolition. And I came to abolition largely through organizing, through collective work, and through the political work of an organization that I've just mentioned before, Critical Resistance, an international organization has been working for over 2 decades to end our reliance on the prison industrial complex. I just want to make 4, just quick observations about abolition in this political moment, just as things that I'm thinking about, and I'd love to hear. I'm looking forward to our dialogue, also to learn what other people are thinking about in relation to abolition in this political moment. I want to just flag first, quick four things: the value of collectives and networks. Abolition organizations and networks are key sites of critical and ongoing political education. I mean, I know that I used the word abolition before I knew what it meant, right? But I had the opportunity to be in relation and in dialogue with groups of people and organizations that offered me the opportunity to sort of learn and unlearn knowledges. And I also think collectives and networks remind us of an important truth that no one person, is the solution. That organizations and collectives connected to social movements, produce the sharpest and most useful knowledges to build the world that we know we need, and they're in it for the long haul. So I think, just thinking about abolition in this moment, the imperative and the importance of looking to groups and organizations and getting connected ourselves with them in any way that, that we're able to. And the second thing I want to flag about abolition in this moment is that for many of us, abolition has always been, has always meant what we want to build and make as much as what we want to try to dismantle or divest from. And I think that this is crucially important right now as we're working to advance campaigns to divest from police. We also have to defund police. The parallel argument is, what do we need to be building? What do we need to be investing in? What do we need to be working towards? So that really dynamic is central. I think crucial. So abolition has always been about the work to try, to experiment, to invest in, and to build together. I think crucial. The third thing that I wanted to flag about abolition in this moment is the imperative of sort of naming and challenging the underlying structures that drive the prison industrial complex. So white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ableism, colonialism, capitalism, they may seem to some like 25-cent words, but they're the fuel, they're the lifeblood, they're the necessary oxygen for a prison industrial complex. It's no good to get rid of the police if we're not also working simultaneously to end white supremacy or to end transphobia and misogyny. So we need to be thinking about these as interrelated and mutually co-constitutive movements. And the final thing I just wanted to flag about abolition in this moment is the necessity of growing abolition in sites or times that we might see as unlikely or awkward. So I think in this political moment, as we're mobilizing around defunding the police, I think it's as crucial, as central to be thinking about how, for example, social workers, I think it's about 75% of the masters in social work population is white women in the United States. How does that constituency also engage in policing and punishment, particularly towards Black caregivers? So I think thinking about any sort of like unlikely or less likely to us places, how can we be growing abolition, right? Of yes, defund police, divest and invest, but also how can we be moving and thinking about growing abolition in unlikelier spaces perhaps to us? Thinking about our families and relationships, how am I addressing harm? How am I dealing with conflict? Where is misogyny naturalized in my life? So of course, yes to defund police, but also growing abolition in places that we might see or feel as outside of the prison industrial complex. So I'm gonna pause there and pivot and invite the amazing Sabina Vaught to join for a conversation. And I just wanted to start the remarks by kind of grounding us in a little bit of a critical genealogy, how we got here, and that's just one snippet, one moment, and then also just offering a couple of comments about abolition in this moment. I know we're hearing a lot about it, and just acknowledging some perspectives that I think are central. So now we're going to move, and I was pushing Sabina to make this a dialogue as opposed to a monologue. So we might see us kind of jumping back and forth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we jump in, I want to sort of second all of Erica's thank yous and recognitions, but just say again, thank you to Dr. Elon Dancy for the programming that makes all of this possible, and for inviting me to be in a lopsided dialogue with Erica. How about that? Thank you, Chris Wright, for that great introduction, and for Cassia Krogan's work, making sure behind the scenes that all of this happens the way it happens, which is a mystery to me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, Erica, and I appreciate your interest in dialogue. I sent you some questions, and I'm going to switch it up on you. I hope that's okay. But after listening to you, I think, I really appreciate the way your glimpse into part of one critical genealogy both invites us to understand and to remember that significant change, this kind of work is, as you said repeatedly, it's the long haul. And it's this sort of deep and abiding commitment. And it's uneven and bumpy. And I appreciate your telling the story of that, and telling it in such a way that we were able to see that that was just a tiny glimpse into so much labor and energy and time that goes unrecognized. And so I think that sort of segues into my first question for you, which is, you've been doing this work in community for a very long time. And I want to acknowledge that, but also think about what that looks like when that moves into scholarly work. And you really introduced our field to abolition, and maybe 15 or more years ago, but I think most primarily through your book, Right to be Hostile: Schools, Prisons, and the Making of Public Enemies. And yet, and that book was a widely read, taught, engaged, cited book, and yet abolition stayed very peripheral. So you really invite us into it. You, at the end of the book, really kind of issue maybe even a charge. Maybe you want to dispute that, but sort of lay it out for us to consider. And yet it stays peripheral. And I think you and I talked recently, and you're a wholly generous person. So my question is going to be maybe a little more of a downer than perhaps your perception. But I would really love for you to think with us about what happens when ideas get taken up by scholars. So we sometimes talk about, oh, the university, as if that's sort of separate from actual people who are faculty members. But what happens when scholars take up an idea? And I appreciated you saying, you took up abolition before you fully understood, and hopefully all of us are always understanding more deeply those things that we're thinking about. But what happens when things become trendy? And we see this in our field. It's the field we know. I'm sure it happens in other disciplines and fields. But we see this sort of, you can think of them. Racial capitalism was really trendy for a while, and people were talking all about it, but sort of not anchored in the knowledge traditions and in the community work that had built that over not just decades, generations. Things like anti-Blackness or Afro-pessimism, right? They become these sort of catchphrases, and then they get abandoned for the next thing. And so how do we think about organized forgetting, to use your framework, as something that we may unintentionally or intentionally participate in? How do we think about holding faculty and scholars sort of accountable to acknowledging these critical genealogies, acknowledging their role as learners and not sort of instant experts on work and ideas that have these deep and collective? I think you reminded us repeatedly how collective this work is. How do we sort of hold ourselves and one another accountable for thinking carefully and working in community and in collaboration, rather than adopting new and trendy sort of expertise? So how do we do that? And what's the impact when we do and don't do that?
Thank you for that amazing question. And I love that it was sort of, prefaced by, I was feeling, I'm old now. I've been doing this for such a long time that I feel like an OG, right? And it's sort of like I'm either the oldest person in the room or the youngest person in the room. So, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I'm just sort of recognizing that I've been sort of on the thinking about abolition for a significant time period. So yes, I just want to. I think that question is so important, and it's a familiar question, right? Whether it was, I often tell the joke that when my provost at a public event, several years ago, used the term intersectionality in one of his, kind of campus lectures. There was sort of like a sense of deflation on my part, like, well, we can't use that word anymore. I mean, so I think what one thing that the state, as I was saying in my comments, the state has the ability to do is sort of take language, take concepts that are produced from social movements, that are produced from collective organizing, those analytics, that language, and kind of strip them of politics and strip them of kind of their meaning, and then sort of deliver them back to us as kind of services or kind of projects. And I think that the Academy is part of that. We participate in that work, right? For better and for worse. So I do think that that's a tense, kind of we're in a sort of a tense political moment, but it's also a moment of opportunity. Like, I want to hold the sort of both and around abolition at this moment. Like, I think both, it's worrisome that, I'm at, public events and, fabulous young organizers now, it's an identity instead of a politic or a practice, claim abolition as, and I think that's both wonderful and amazing to be, in a room full of people who identify as abolitionists, where there's more possibility for even introducing or dialoguing or having public education or political education around those materials. So I think that's an enormous opportunity, right? But it's also, then you're the kind of like the old person in the room who's like, what do you mean by that term? Like, do you mean the same thing about abolition that I mean about abolition? It's like me and my former provost. Do you mean the same thing about intersectionality that I mean about intersectionality? So I do think that there's like a, it's a challenging moment. And that's why I feel like that sort of, I wanted to offer a little bit of that talk around critical genealogies in this moment, because I think that I remember when I started graduate school, the concept of multiculturalism was already seen as sort of passé. And, we didn't, read a lot about that when I was in grad school, or, because we were already sort of on the new, whatever the new was. And I remember then going to a panel discussion from some, fabulous scholars and thinkers and movement folks talking about, how, radical and revolutionary that concept was when it was, conceptualized, and what interventions it made. And it sort of made me, have a little more humility and sort of think about these genealogies and not, the importance of sort of thinking deeply, thinking rigorously, thinking collectively, deeply and rigorously. When we use frameworks, when we're your other point about about this movement, I think that the majority of knowledge that's produced from social movements, the majority of meaningful knowledge is produced from social and political movements, right? I'll say that. And then I think how do we, when it migrates into other spaces, what gets lost, what lines of accountability are severed, what kind of meanings. So I think your conversation is an amazing, or your question is an amazing question. And I just want to come back to this sort of both and, right? Like both, it's an opportunity that the concept is proliferating. It's an opportunity to engage in dialogue. It's an opportunity for study, right? For study on the Black radical tradition, on that tradition of that history of that concept, right? It's an opportunity. It's also a win, I think we have to claim, as much as it's a temporal and maybe a sort of it's a fugitive win. It is a win I think we should own. And I think on the other side, not to be too binary here, it's also, kind of a worrisome political moment where we're trying to figure out what exactly, what do people mean by that? Are we going to lose that concept? How is it going to be absorbed? Is it going to be, watered down and, then, built, sort of mean anything to anyone? So, I mean, I'm holding on to the positive side right now because I feel like that's what I see in my communities and my landscapes. But I'm also, I feel that worry as well.
So maybe as a follow-up to that, and this may be too specific, but so if you and I were to convene a conference, or we were to create a panel and position ourselves as experts on science education, we might get, right, because we're not, just to make clear to everyone, and not even like remotely, there might be a whole lot of conversation about that, and not just about sort of our decision that we're experts on science ed, but also what's the impact then on the integrity of that study, and then on teacher preparation, and then of course on what happens in schools. And so I wonder if there's a parallel way you might think about, I don't think science education and abolition in education are parallels at all, but in terms of thinking about how do we engage something in the field as it is and as we imagine it should be and could be and are working to make it be, what is the way to sort of have some fidelity to this rich, rigorous work that's been done, and imagine then how it could move into teacher preparation and schools in a way that, to your point, it doesn't become an add-on or sort of all things to everyone and therefore nothing, but something that has the shape it needs to have to do the work it needs to do.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. I mean, I think, my response to everything is it's always a moment to study. So I think that's sort of my elevation of collectives as well. And I think that it's just, I think one thing that, for example, Critical Resistance, I think has done incredibly well over the last 2 decades is produce political education materials and produce language and, volumes, and same with Insight, Women and Trans Folks of Color Against Violence, anthologies, readings. So I think that, I think it's always, entering into a new discourse field or a new discourse community. I think the onus is on, those of us that are moving into it, to learn, to study, to unlearn. And I think that there's such a rich trajectory and a rich set of resources that are available for us. Through the kind of history of the Black radical tradition, and this, from W.E.B. Du Bois, all the way up to my comrade Rachel Hertzing, right? So I think that there's so much available materials, and I think that I think doing that kind of collectively, doing that in conversation, doing that as a community, I think is also really an important kind of contribution to think about how do we, and I know that we're all like doing a million things at once, so I think the burden of community and learning together is an extra piece of labor, but I do think that that's crucial here because I don't think abolition is like a recipe or a checklist, right? Or or a set or something that we're going to be able to implement. Rather, we're talking about ways of knowing, ways of being, a methodology, a politic, right? That's connected to a practice. So I think that requires community, requires engagement, requires people, right? So I think that if we're excited about this work and we're thinking about moving into it, first of all, welcome, and I think it's welcome. It sounds like I'm inviting us all to a party. Welcome, right? But I think that learning and study is central, and doing so collectively is also central. That's the two things that I might lift up. And then, connected to study, there's just so many wonderful resources and materials available. And then also make your own, right? Work collectively to, produce materials based on what you're learning and thinking that connect to the context that you're in and the context that you're working in, whether it's science education or, or not.
Thank you for that. And I think you have actually modeled that in your own work. So you started out your work in this sort of school to prison pipeline framework, and then really helped many of us think about making a shift to the school prison nexus, not school to prison. Some people insert the two in there because it seems to want to make its way, but that nexus. And then in the piece you shared with everyone that you and Miriam Caba wrote, you even suggest there's a school prison swamp which I thought was an interesting framework. But you've sort of done the work both, and I shouldn't say both, but across multiple contexts and in multiple communities, to think really deeply about how important reframing is, what it does, what it means for our understanding and our praxis. So I wonder if you want to share a little bit about that shift from school to prison pipeline to the nexus or the swamp, and then what that might mean for right now, this current moment.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's so interesting because it also sort of speaks to your question, really reminds us that, there's like different kinds of audiences that we produce, that messaging materials, analytics speak to and for and with, right? And, I wrote that first book in part because I was trying to, most of the writing that I've done has been trying to solve problems in my practices, like trying to figure out how things that I know are connected, aren't connected, or struggling through, questions and tensions. And I feel like writing is kind of a helpful way sometimes for me to sort through stuff. So I wrote that first book because I was, teaching at a public, a university, largely at that time in a teacher training program, and doing a lot of anti-prison abolitionist work. And I was like, I see connections, but I just trying to figure out like how it goes. But also young people, largely young people of color, right, across the country were organizing under this language of ending the school to prison pipeline, largely connected to pushing for restorative justice practices or the reallocation of budgetary resources at that time. And that language was magnetic. Like people were kind of gravitating towards, and still do gravitate towards, that language because of its visceral kind of imagery, right? But young people, when they were making those demands 15, 20 years ago, were not making a simplistic demand for just, the kind of, that schools are prisons, but they were making sort of, revolutionary, radical demands for new worlds, new systems, new visions. I think how those demands by young people got absorbed by the state and then fed back to them as, we're going to maybe change a few school disciplinary policies. Maybe we're going to do tiny little, tinkering with tweaking Armageddon, as Comrade Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about it. So that's the response from the state. So young people, when I was started to write that book, I was like, with my sort of analytic, I'm a university person hat, I started to think that's not the, that language, school to prison pipeline, is too linear, it doesn't really kind of capture the, the wider, contexts that are at play here. So I, started to use a different term in that book project. Just because I still sort of feel mixed about it. I think analytically, I'm, kind of, this is an echo of your first question. Analytically, that's, school to prison nexus, or, even, just not even separating schools from the wider carceral landscape. Why are we doing that, right? Is still helpful for us to sort of analytic. But I also want to just, make sure that, that to sort of elevate that, people still use the language in community organizing of school to prison pipeline, and it still resonates and it's still effective for organizing, right? I think it can narrow the demands, right, that we make, that communities end up making. So I just want to, flag that. And our colleague Damien Sojourner, and I know Sabina's work has really, written, incredibly profoundly and usefully, reminding us that the whole project of, education, in a white supremacist, capitalist, settler, colonial, heteropatriarchy, right, is imbricated, in the project of carcerality. So there's not just like, we can't just do a few tiny sort of tweaking our Armageddon fixes. But the part of me that's accountable to community-based organizations wants to make sure that we're careful in how we recognize the analytics that's produced there. Not that communities are always right and university people are always wrong. It's not that simple. But I think that we want to honor the kind of knowledge demands and the political moment that shaped those and continues to shape those. So I think for language today, I try to use the old school, just prison industrial complex, right? Sometimes, I think that's just such a helpful term. I've been doing a lot of work around child and family services lately. So I think language matters here. Dorothy Roberts uses that great term, the family regulation system, or carceral state. So I try really hard to have, be careful and precise in my language. And sometimes I'm less so because I get, caught up in things, but I really work hard because I think language is so how we talk about, we talk about the landscape that we're in is so central, because that helps us imagine and see different tentacles, and that also then helps us think about points of intervention. So I do think central, but so thanks for that question. Good.
Yeah, and I think in your response, you gestured a little bit to current work. So I wonder if you want to share some current work, and I'll add in something that I think I heard you raising, and if this works for your thinking through your work with everyone, great, and if not, great. But you talked about this sort of, it's not sort of contest about who knows best, the university or community. And yet there is this tension that you've pointed to, this sort of sustained tension. And I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about this, right? That she hasn't been incarcerated. She'll be at meetings with people who are formerly incarcerated, who will say, you don't know what you're talking about because you haven't been incarcerated. And so how to kind of navigate that just complex set of dynamics in a way that's toward common cause, toward shared commitments and goals, and sort of if there's a way for you to think about that and talk about your current work, great. If not, I think folks would love to just hear about the current thinking.
Yeah, no, I think those are both crucial questions, right? I mean, I think on the quickly on the current work, I've been very interested in, as a long time, feminist, thinking about the relationship between abolition and feminism, because I have spent a long time trying to reconcile those different realms, or in my mind, that's what I was trying to do. So the most recent sort of book project, Feminist and the Sex Offender, was really an attempt to try to think through those two to show that those two aren't discrete domains, discrete analytics. They're actually interrelated analytics, and the reason why we have this amazing political moment around abolition in this moment is because of a genealogy, as I was alluding to earlier, of in particular women of color feminisms, from the Combahee River Collective to Rosa Parks anti-rape organizing, to the Crunk Feminist Collective, to the three queer Black feminists behind the Black Lives Matter movement. So that there's from the work of Insight, from the work of CR, that we want to make sure that we're being able to talk about abolition as always a feminist project, in part because what's the push right now around defunding the police? It's like, what are we going to do about gender and sexual violence, right? Not that policing has ever been a response to end gender and sexual violence, right? So I think that I've done some writing and thinking, because I feel like that seems like an important it's an important intervention for the communities I'm a part of right now, to be able to show that that feminism and abolition are interrelated, and to make sure that we're not, as we continue to build and experiment around abolition, we're always keeping that sort of feminism central to an abolitionist politic. And then your second question, I think it's a great question. I think that, we both need, people with, we need leadership by people most impacted, around dismantling, our prison industrial complex. But we need everyone to be doing different kinds of work and working, right? I think that the body of work and the organizations, that I'm connected to, trying to think collectively, not individually, around, building engagement and responses, and trying to get out of the way sometimes, right? So that, when is this a moment for somebody with my the organizations that I'm part of are me and my knowledge bases to step up and to take up space, to, you know, to do something, and when is it not, right? And also, when, yeah. So I think absolutely great, great question, important question. Yeah. I know that you have to go in 2 minutes, so I was just wondering. I want also, like, this was supposed to be a dialogue, and now we're on the monologue end of it. I just want to, yeah. And I know that your work, your new work around gender and juvenile justice, I'm wondering if you just can just take a minute, and if there's anything that I was saying about feminism and abolition, if there's something that resonates with your kind of new emerging work that you feel like you could share, because I do think that this sort of, I'm interested in, given that so much of our collective political organizing is done by women. I'm just interested to know. I want to know what you're working on.
Well, thank you for that. And as I mentioned to you all earlier, Erica is wholly generous. I'm actually gonna ask for us to do a remix at some point, and we can talk about that. But Chris Wright, who's gonna hop on, has read my most recent work more recently than I've read my most recent work, if that makes sense. So he probably knows better what I've been thinking and talking about. So I'm gonna send that question unfairly off to Chris. But I do just want to say, Erica, I'm just so always grateful to be in conversation with you. Always learning so much from thinking together and from just listening to you reflect and to share all the just extraordinary work you're always involved in. It's really kind of incredible. And as I wrote in my last book, and I mean this, and I want to share this with everyone on this, whatever we are, webcast. Kevin Kumashiro introduced you to me, and I count that introduction just among like the most important and extraordinary of my life. And I really think it's hard to convey what kind of impact someone has on your all the parts of what it means to be human. And you really, I'm not alone in that. I know that you have this really incredible ability to give and to dramatically alter people's experiences and understandings. And so I'm grateful, and I want to share that gratitude with everyone here, because that doesn't get cited or credited in the world, but it's really, and the work you do is extraordinary. So thank you. And I have to hop off to this exciting tenure talk that was scheduled months ago. But I know the rest of the conversation will be great because Chris Wright is phenomenal. So I'm going to say goodbye to both of you, and everyone, thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. I'm going to talk about you when you're gone.
Tell me about it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a delight. It's really a delight.
All right. And I am back. I wanted to move into some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. And then I also had a couple of questions that arose as I was listening to you speak as well. So I'm hoping we can dialogue in that way as well. But first, this is a really great question. So this person was happy that you introduced the idea of sort of newfound expertise, so that was introduced between you and Dr. Vaught's dialogue. But the question is, how has the idea of learning become so downplayed that everyone feels the need to be an expert? And I'll just tag on to the end of that. You talked about the importance of collectives and networks, and I understand learning as being collective and as being integral to abolition networks. How has the individualization of learning become so popular? And in your experiences, have you seen that within the groups in the networks that you were in, and has it had like adverse like complications to the overall organizing effort.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question in the chat box, and also for rejoining us, Chris, and for adding and deepening that question. You know, I mean, I think it's a particular, I mean, ironically, maybe people will disagree with me. I think it's actually a particular problem for people in universities, right? Because we have to be, we're individuals, we have to be experts. You know, we are commanding our classroom. You know, we can't, we finished our PhD, we clearly, you know, we have our knowledge base, and we don't actually have in universities a very good culture of ongoing, for faculty in particular, of ongoing kind of collective learning. I would love to be contradicted. Maybe, you know, I have been actually slightly contradicted on this, you know, this visit, meeting with really wonderful groups, but, you know, largely, you know, students, right? So, so I do think that the project of the university, you know, oddly, you know, mitigates, you know, you get the job, you're a tenured faculty member, you're teaching your expertise, and then putting yourself in the position where you know, are learning something new is awkward. I was reminded of this also during the White co-conspirators call, you know, thinking particularly around, you know, sort of white people's willingness to challenge white supremacy, which is going to be messy. It's going to be uncomfortable. You know, we might be wrong. We're going to be wrong and make mistakes. And it's sort of you know, how unfamiliar that experience is, how much we don't want to put ourselves in those kinds of contexts where we're uncomfortable, where we have to unlearn things, where we, you know, where we are not the experts in the room. So, and I don't want to sort of romanticize community-based contexts, that it's more possible there, but I think the project is, you know, is different than a university project, you know, like a faculty university project or a staff university project. So I love that idea of, you know, that we, you know, sort of doing this work, you know, for me, I mean, I feel like I'm, you know, I'm always learning, always changing, you know, always trying to grow. And for me to sort of begin some of the work around abolition, that I mean, I really had to learn and unlearn and be, as you said, not by oneself, but in community. And the university was a great, both a great day job for that, but also was a, you know, wonderful, I had some of the tools available to me. Like I could take, you know, classes, I had access to resources. You know, this was after I had finished my PhD. So I think it's a privileged space to be, and I just want to mark that. So yeah, great. Thank you for that question.
Absolutely. And so I had a bit of a follow-up to that, since we're on the topic of university. So we can understand that universities have a lot of problems. In many ways, they are fundamentally racist, fundamentally anti-Black, but we still sort of exist within them. Can you speak to what it means to want to radically change and or abolish a system that you are tied directly into? And have you experienced that within your work? How do you sort of deal with existing within the tensions of, I work here and the community is here, but the system that sort of governs the practices of this institution are like moral non-starters for me, against my actual morals and values?
I love that line, moral non-starters. I just feel like I'm gonna borrow that, Chris. It's a non-starter. Yes. I mean, I work at a public, just as a little bit of context, I work at a public university in Chicago, where many of the students are like me, the first in their family to go to college. First generation, lots of students of color, you know, average undergraduate is a, 27-year-old woman of color, right? Often a parent or a caregiver, and in other kinds of ways. So I have a deep and abiding affinity and allegiance to, the communities that are trying to learn and survive at my institution. And many of my coworkers, but like you, I mean, the university is not one thing. It's not a monolith, right? I'll say that. Like we are, part and parcel of that. But also at the same time, I mean, it's histories. It's, from the field of criminology that mints out new, racial profiling algorithms to, the discipline of psychology that comes up with more matrices and models and norms that are pathologizing, deviancy and difference, which just so conveniently often happens to be, communities of color, queer folks, and or poor folks. So the project of the university is, genocidal, right? It's in its foundation, in its history, and I think without being too trendy, I think, I love Sabina's earlier comments. What a brilliant entity. I do take a little love from, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's University in the Undercommons. There's just such, beautiful little passages in there about, we're in the Undercommons, right? Like here we are, our conversation yesterday, the conversation that I had this morning with the Heinz scholars. These universities allow us, access to resources, access for us to, paper from the photocopiers. I always like to say, if hopefully nobody that I know is watching, or we can make, use the, get community groups access to physical space, which is a diminishing commodity for free. We can write letters for people's parole or probation, right? We can leverage and use those resources that are attached to it. But, I feel like I never want to I want to try hard never to be in the university, right? But, of it or there. And I think that that's a hard distinction, to make as, my dental insurance is, paid by the university. I'm privileged to have health insurance. And so many of our comrades that I work with. So I think lines of accountability can get a little, we were talking about that earlier, a little blurry. And I think it's hard for people in university-based contexts or in any context of access to privilege, right? To, retain some sort of accountability to organizations and movements. And to be sort of real about that for the long haul and present about that. And I think, having people in our beloved communities remind us, like, hey, Erica, you're not all that in a bag of chips. As a friend of mine said, you got to show up and put the chairs out. Your job is to, finish that grant application, or, so I think, really, thinking about accountability, thinking about how we do that. But yes, I mean, the project of the university, is and thinking about what the project, I mean, I'm heartened that people are, reading Fred Moten and Stefano Harney now. And I think that these little, temporary or temporal moments of fugitivities that we can get in these spaces are so valuable. And I think that they can and are useful towards supporting and building and being in solidarity with social and political movements. And there's also real movements on our campuses, whether it's removing police from our campuses. These aren't just symbolic. I think that these are important struggles around Black studies and ethnic studies, as we can see from our current occupant of the White House, right, are not just symbolic, they're material. And we can and should be leveraging and working in ways that we, from our positions of privilege, to intervene in those. So thank you for that great question.
Absolutely, and thank you for the response. I partly asked that because I struggle with that. I've been struggling with that for a while, but I know that others who are watching struggle with that as well. Okay, I want to move into another question, and this is sort of going to bring us to the current moment. How might abolition help us think about our current pandemic, the moments and realities of the current pandemic? And how are you reading empire politics in this moment? And what are the implications for education, schooling, and just minoritized populations broadly?
Right, pandemic, empire politics, and I might have to come back to you for the third one, right? Yes, the pandemic. I mean, I think that there's, I think that, thinking, to quote the amazing Arundhati Roy, thinking about the pandemic as sort of a portal, as a way of making visible and bringing into stark relief, in this political moment, deep, long-standing issues of, the lack of, white supremacy and access to resources, including healthcare. So I think that no one, that's the moment that we're in. And I think that, I do think that abolition and demands sort of, the demand to defund the police, people are, I think we're a little bit more willing in this political moment to sort of imagine, move outside of the status quo, the everyday, because of the conditions of the pandemic. So I don't quite want to say that the pandemic has made sort of abolitionist imagining more possible, but I do think it has put more, the fact that our traditional, just kind of leaping to, I think what was the third question a little bit, thinking about our traditional K through 12 schools, like we could get rid of standardized tests, right? During the pandemic, because they just weren't feasible. And did our public school system collapse? No, right? I think that there's sort of a crisis, right? Deep crisis, which, engineered or otherwise. I think we want to acknowledge that our current healthcare crisis is engineered in part, because of these sort of histories, because of who we, put in power in the White House, because of our inability to have a meaningful, and affirming public healthcare system and free. So I think we want to sort of acknowledge that it's an engineered, partially an engineered crisis. But I think crisis always, sort of opens up a possibility, a window of possibility. We were talking earlier about the sort of the bull fan around abolition in this moment, both a sort of possibility and also, what might we be losing. I think similarly, sort of the crisis of the pandemic has made us rethink normal, right? In so many ways. At a significant and of course incredible cost, right, for many of us. I think the second question was around empire, and I'm not sure if I'm got the full question right, so you can redirect me. But I think what for me, what has been continues to be energizing around abolitionist organizing is that it's sort of internationalist. A framework from a foundation, right? And I use the word internationalist, and it's like old school Marxist sense here, and because I think that there is the kind of work that's produced, whether it's Harsha Walia's amazing work around dismantling borders and decolonialism, whether it's the brilliant work of Bent Bars, the queer organization, abolitionist organization and No More Cages in the UK. I think that and there's a sort of an internationalist network of people sharing resources, analysis, tools that has been really been building. So I think that one of the challenges is that the U.S. in the U.S. we are so insular, and the histories we draw on, even the history that I offered today in my little short snippet was U.S. specific, but I think we really lose a lot when we're not looking internationally and drawing on other histories of resistance, other histories of other social movements, other abolitionist and proto-abolitionist struggles. So I think that is always a particular shortfall of people who are residing in this nation that gets called the United States, and I think it's sort of an imperative for learning. And I think there was a third question, Chris.
Actually, it was a 3-tier question. You actually hit on every part of it. The third part actually was the implications for schools, which you did touch on already. So yeah, you were spot on. Okay. Go ahead.
I'll just echo for the school-based one. Just echo that that there's a vibrant Cops Out of Schools campaign. Emerging all across, in every urban city. So I think that and of course, thinking about my earlier remarks, is not just what we need to divest from, but what we need to invest in central. So folks that are really thinking about school-based contexts, I do think that sort of looking around and paying attention to the anti-policing campaigns, also the work to get ICE. There's some great work that's been done I'll just flag comrades in Durham, South Carolina, who teachers who organized so that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, couldn't get information or couldn't come onto their school campus, right? So I think that, you know, that there's so much important work that, and often, you know, not visible, that young folks, teachers, parents, community members are doing to sort of, you know, challenge the prison industrial complex. Sometimes one policy, one practice, one kind of organization, one facet of it at a time. Right? So yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So for the next question, and this is kind of a follow-up to the conversation that we had yesterday. I had sort of asked you, what is the role of feminism within abolition movements? And so the question is, within abolition movements, like, I sort of see abolition movements as working to dismantle a system that is inevitably surrounding them at all times. And so in your experiences with doing this work, what should these groups be doing to assure that those systems don't creep their way into the movement, to make sure that those who are marginalized within abolition movements, their voices are not silenced, to make sure that their voices are at the forefront, to make sure that racism and sexism and transphobia is not at the forefront of movements for anti-racism and movements for LGBTQ rights? In what ways do you make sure that they are pure within the idea of abolition and sort of revolution for all people?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you know, I'll give maybe a quick, easy response and then kind of come back to it. One easy response is that those people and that analysis and those histories and those movements that have, you know, why don't we know who Bo Brown is? Like, why don't we know Stormy Ogden? Like those, you know, those actual people who are, you know, queer, who are trans, who are and/or you know, First Nations, who've been, you know, building analysis, building organizations, you know, participating in campaigns. You know, I think that sort of we need to be centering their thinking, their practice, their collective labors. You know, I mean, Marsha P. Johnson, you know, and Sylvia Rivera, right, and the histories of the Stonewall Uprising. So I think one thing is to sort of make sure that our learning, you know, is always sort of like centering the voices and the analysis, right, and the experience and the collective vision, right, of who's come before. Right? I think that's one intervention we can make, and also in this political moment, right? You know, if there's an event, if there's a convening, a practice, a table, whatever it is, it's got to be big enough so that everybody's there, right? Maybe it makes it unwieldy and messy, and people are calling in from the prison, right? But I feel like that kind of intentionality. I always remember we brought Lane Mullett from Decarcerate PA out to Chicago because we were working on long-term sentences for people. And, you know, Lane had pre-recorded testimony from people inside from part of the Decarcerate PA collective. So Lane, you know, could travel in the free world, but Lane brought specific, you know, kind of audio recorded testimony from people inside, you know, to participate in that event in Chicago. And I was like, hot damn, you know, we got to be doing that, right? Everything takes a little slower, but, you know, nothing about us without us, to use the slogan of the disability rights movement, right? You know, I think that is central. So, and I think that, you know, we can use our imaginations and kind of do that in different kinds of ways. And then you had I had one more point related to what you were saying, but it just left my mind like a cloud on a summer day. But maybe it'll come back to me. It'll come back to me.
Okay, that sounds good. So another question from one of the audience members. So they want to know if you can talk about the ways in which you have incorporated your work in teacher preparation, or what ideas you may have for those who are doing the work of teacher preparation and who want to teach abolition and teach in that way.
Great, thank you for that wonderful question. You know, the Education for Liberation Network and Critical Resistance has been working for the last several years on compiling a toolkit of, like, you know, narratives from young people, visuals, right? The fabulous Lee Patel did an amazing interview with T.L. Lewis and has just a wonderful visual and kind of narrative interpretation of that. Examples of campaigns, reflections on campaigns. So, I mean, all that to say is, TVA, that will be coming out in 2021, because the idea of that project is to really proliferate, not to say there's one right way to do it, but here are multiple kinds of ways, from campaigns, from curriculum, from other kinds of engagement. So that's coming out. And there's, I think the other thing, I'm not sure where the questioner is, the person who asked the question is located, but I think that kind of looking outside of university walls, and I strongly suspect that wherever you are, there's a church group, there's a synagogue, there's a mosque, there's a community-based organization, there's a storefront that is working to challenge the prison industrial complex, and they will love you to come, to their meeting. They'll love you to reach out. They'd love to know how to connect. So sort of building relationships, trying to find out, what these organizations are doing, and how it might connect to the school. And I was talking on one of the calls, I think that we also sort of assume that, our school is somehow free of the prison industrial complex is something, already over there, and we have to have this new conversation about it, but it's already going on in your school. If you have school resource officers or police in there, you probably have students, young people in your school who have parents that are locked up, right? Who maybe have been arrested or stopped themselves, right? You have teachers that have, so I think, trying to name, the obvious, and there's some new curricular great resources, making sure that your library has books, that reflect the lives of young people who have family members locked up, right? Making sure that, that there are kind of resources for people to, we might, to help understand, like, why we're in this political moment. So I think that there's so many points of intervention for that great question, whether it's getting better, kind of changing the curriculum, whether it's building partnerships with community-based organizations, whether it's kind of just stepping back and trying to recognize the very many tentacles that the prison industrial complex has in, in the school already, and trying to clip those, systemically, whether, I think there's just so many profound ways. And I think that the exciting point is there's so many tentacles of overlap that there's so many places to work, right? There's so many points of intervention that we can be making. So thank you. I just want to say, teacher training programs, we have to get rid of the mandatory criminal background check, right? Which is, required in almost all college and university applications. But before people go into schools to teach, they have to do do any kind of internship, they have to do a criminal background check, right? Which functions as a huge gatekeeper. So here we have all these people, with lived experience of the prison industrial complex, who often want to go and be teachers, right? They want to work with young people, right? And they have to pay $80 for a biometric background check that excludes them. And there's no evidence, right, that a prior, it's again this sort of, I like to call them fact-free policies, right, that proliferate. I think that it's our work, for those of us with access to power and privilege, to stand up and say, why do we have that criminal background check? What is that? How is that effective, right? So very, very, very important policies that we can take leadership on, and we should be.
Absolutely. I love that response. Okay, moving into the next one. Open quotes, I guess, as you could say. I'm quoting this. As a white LGBTQ plus person involved in this work, I sometimes feel a tension between my dominant vulnerable identities and the dominant/vulnerable identities of the folks I work along with from other racial or gender communities. Do you see the concept of abolition as a politic or practice being helpful in this space of identifying those tensions and working through them?
Great, thanks for that thoughtful question again. And I'm not sure that discomfort or tension is a bad thing always, right? So I just want to flag that. We do have a prison industrial complex that disproportionately, that's such a meek or mild word. Let's just rephrase that. We do have a prison industrial complex, that explicitly targets, particular communities, Black and brown folks, queer folks, poor folks, folks with disabilities. So if we don't see ourselves, or we're not part of those communities, and yet we see ourselves in solidarity, in struggle with those communities, maybe, I think, we should feel discomfort, anger, frustration, awkwardness, in that grotesque asymmetry, right, of our prison industrial complex. So I just wanted to flag that from your comments. And then I think you had asked a really interesting question about whether abolition is a helpful analytic, or a practice there. And I think, I would argue yes, right? Because I think that, abolition is, asking us to do the work, as I mentioned earlier, to see, of course, defunding the police, removing immigration and customs enforcement, right, as the project, but as important is the project to also dismantle white supremacist, capitalist, ableist, heteropatriarchy, and we have to see those as intersecting and interlocking work. So then I think there's place to work for all of us, and also a place for all of us to be differentially, it's not the same, uncomfortable, right? Because we all need to be sort of working on challenging those at different moments and different times. So so yes, sort of like was easy answer. Yes, on the check, do I think that abolition is helpful there? Yes, I centrally, right? Yeah, kind of a short answer to a long question.
Absolutely. And I agree completely with you. The systems of oppression are interlocking, and you have to keep that at the forefront when you're doing this work. Okay. And so I think we're approaching our time. I'm gonna ask another question, and then I know Dr. Dancy wants to leave us with some words. So for the last question, what do you tell the person who has sort of given up hope, and the person who believes that abolition should be a radical change that happens the next day, or that happens the next month or the next year? But for the folks who are oppressed and want to see an immediate change within the system, what do you tell them, or sort of how do you explain the longevity of abolition and how it's a process that sort of carries along generationally?
Another just wonderful question. I think it is heartbreaking, the kinds of losses that mount, and so the sort of this temporal tension between this incredible urgency, right, about what's happening in this political moment, and the fact that we can, in just a matter of several years, change the conversation on cash money bond, change the conversation. Like now police are having to be on the defensive, about their funding sources, which was unimaginable a couple of years ago. So we can have these enormous changes, these enormous costs, and yet we still have so far to go, right? So I just want to acknowledge the depth of that question, and just, kind of feel the pain, related to that question, and also know that, that's in one sense insurmountable, right? And then I'll say, having said that, just recognizing, losses so deep, and yet we can also everything can be changing so rapidly. Like we couldn't imagine that the police would have to be, like Chicago city budget spends 40% of its city budget on policing and is having to defend that, right? And the police are having to defend their budget, which was unimaginable, and still so much work to go. I think that this is where my point about collectives and networks is just sustaining. Like, I mentioned, Lee Patel and Sabina Vaught, and we talked about the sort of alienation of the university and its, genocidal project, right? For lack of a better term. That having people, different communities, different networks, that, where there's some shared political analysis, there's some shared vision. I think finding community is a way to have some joy, for the long haul. Like I can't tell you how many campaigns we ran. A campaign called "Leave No Child Behind Bars," to try to shut down juvenile prisons like 11 years ago in Illinois, which the governor actually just this year said they were going to shut them down, kind of not quite. So we claimed victory 12 years later. We named our campaign "Leave No Child Behind Bars," and it was we had like we had a fundraiser that raised like $800. I think, Lewis Wallace organized it. It was like a queer under the sea prom fundraiser that made, and it was fun, right? It made $800 so we could do our political events and make our flyers, right? So I think that there is also, joy in revolutionary struggle. I just want to flag that, incredible losses, right? But also joy in finding community and being connected. I feel like, I feel so privileged to have the opportunity to learn in conversation with communities and groups, and just unlearn and, drink, good food, or eat good food, drink good drinks with, and share space and time with people, and have a beloved, community. And I think that is not the antidote to the urgency and the losses, right? But it makes it sometimes a little more bearable. So I don't think that's the recipe for everyone, but I think it's a little bit of what has sustained me. And I think that's particularly important for teachers and schools. We have our classroom, we're isolated, we're just one, entity. Building community, I think, is really, really central. I know we're going to pivot to Dr. Dancy, and I just want to end by, I think, thanking Dr. Dancy again for creating this space today, this conversation today, but also the other conversations with the Heinz Scholars, with the Equity Scholars, and with the White Co-Conspirators group. I just am really deeply appreciative, and I know how much work it takes to do that. So I want to just acknowledge Dr. Dancy and Chris, Chris Wright, for the wonderful conversation today and yesterday, and to thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to be in conversation and to learn with you. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to extend my thanks to you as well for spending time with us and sharing your stories, experiences, and sharing about your work with us. Thank you so much for that. Right on time, here is Dr. Dancy. He's going to close us out. Thank you again, Dr. Miners.
Yes. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dr. Miners. I enjoyed every bit of today's conversation. I took so much notes, and I want you to know that I took so many notes, and I want you to know that I am grateful for your time, your labor, your mind, your intellectual sensibilities, and engagement of our questions. And so we appreciate you serving as our first visiting scholar of the year. And we want to encourage our audience who are in the School of Education, across the university and beyond, to continue to read, to engage your work, reflect, and think. And we hope that you will work with the center again in other capacities. We truly value that so much. If you're new to the Center for Urban Education's event, this has been our Lunch and Learn, which is an initiative that we see as important for our mantra, which is learn, share, and transform. Learning, speaking to the knowledge production that we engage in the center, sharing, speaking to our efforts to disseminate that, but then also our interests and work toward mutual aid with communities, and then also transformation, which speaks to the thrust and the guiding principle for the work. We want to thank Chris Wright, our brilliant graduate student who has chaired, moderated the session, as well as Dr. Sabina Vaught, our inaugural department chair for teaching, leading, and learning. Many thanks to our center team, particularly Sueño Viveros and Cassia Krogan for the work that they've done to set us up with today's virtual conversation. So I want to let you know about another exciting program that is Thursday, October 22nd, 2020. Join us back here for a Lunch and Learn talk from Dr. Brian Brayboy from Arizona State University. His talk is entitled Hair Stories of Violence, Examining How Hair Mediates Schooling and Social Practices. This will be an urgent engagement of Indigenous knowledge tradition. Finally, know that we update our website regularly. So please go to q.pitt.edu, sign up for our listserv so you can receive regular notifications about our events and other projects. If you're on our website, please check out our most recent newsletter where you can read and learn more about our research, teaching, in service. So that concludes today's Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you again, Erica, and everyone have a good day. Bye-bye.